Born in Vienna, and I lived in Vienna until I was 9 years old. And then my father was transferred to a city called Graz, which is the second largest city in Austria, and that's where I lived during the war. My cousin Liesl lived in Vienna. She still lives in Vienna now. She's still alive. She is about 86, I think, by now. When I was a child and after Hitler took over, whenever my mother put breakfast on the table, every day it was the same thing. She said, if anybody asks you what your parents think of the situation, you always say, ich weiß nicht, I don't know. They would ask the children, and what do your parents say think of that, and the children would say, oh, they say this and that, and then they go and arrest the parents. And he started to build the autobahns, the throughways and so on, and he found a lot, and of course he started arming again, so there were a lot of jobs, right? And people were happy. But then when he started taking over one country after the other, and started fighting in France, and started fighting in Belgium, and in Holland, and later in Russia, and all that, people had it with the war, who wanted a war all the time. Had Jewish relatives, of course. Her father had died, her youngest aunt had died before the war, and then she had an aunt who was married to an Englishman. She happened to be in Austria when Hitler took over, and she tried to get her relatives to come with her to England, but they didn't believe it. They said, oh, there's always a lot of talk, people always make everything sound worse than it really is. No, we will stay. So there was one aunt with 3 children and a husband, and they wound up in a concentration camp. And then there was an uncle who was not married, who had the business with her father, and he was going from one non-Jewish friend to another for almost 2 years before he finally got tired of it, and he went back to his apartment and turned on the gas. He tried to poison himself, but the neighbors smelled the gas and they called the police, and the police took him to a hospital. And my mother happened to be in Vienna with me, and they went in the next time, and the doctor said, yeah, he's coming through fine. Come in tomorrow and pick him up. And when they came in next day to pick him up, the Gestapo had been there first, and they had picked him up. And that was the last we knew of Vicky. As the war ended, we tried to trace them all through the Red Cross, and we were told that Mella and her husband and the children, they had died in a certain concentration. The war progressed. We had to learn how to use a gas mask, how to do push-ups and things with gas masks, because as we got older and the bombing started, kids over 12 who had a bicycle were assigned to a certain district, a certain area to patrol after a bombing, to make sure that no houses were hit. And if any houses were hit, then we had to go and report it. There were different factions going through the city, shooting wildly. And one of the girls I went to school with, that was when I was in 1st grade, and she got in the way and she was shot and killed. The war to dig out the woman I saw maybe half an hour before. And she was the maid to the people who lived next to us, the house next to us, whose name, by the way, was Schwarzenegger. No connection with art, but anyway, the alarm sounded. I came home, opened the door to run into my house. She came out, and I said to her, Frau Bichler, why don't you stay in the basement here, because the alarm has sounded? And she didn't live too far away. She said, oh no, she said, I'm going to go home, I can do something in the meantime. Anyway, her was hit, and we reported it, and then we were ordered to go and try to dig out, and of course I knew she was there. So I said I knew for sure that one person was in the house. Working with a group of Australian prisoners of war who were helping to dig out Frau Bichle from that house. And one of them knew where I lived. And I sort of fainted, and I remember his dragging me home and turning me over to my mother. I was maybe 14, 15, I can't remember. Austrian, probably I did it from the time I was 12 until 16 or so, until the end of the war. It was the habit not to give permission, let's put it that way. He was in civilian clothes and he burned his uniform. So the 5 of us, we went up the mountains with a gun. The Russians were not killing them, but girls were not safe. Let's put it that way. So everything in school changed completely, you know. Everything, so I wouldn't say completely, but the way history was taught, and that was all changed, you know, according to German belief. The Gestapo was like the KGB in Russia. It was a secret police which was spying on people.
Was it the Nazis?
Yeah. In fact, my father's brother was arrested in February 1945. And the reason he was arrested and spent the rest of the war in a concentration camp was because he worked for the Vienna streetcar company. And he went down to the cafeteria to have lunch, as he usually did. And then and nobody knew where my uncle was. There had been no bombings, no caves, no nothing. He was in no hospital, nobody knew where he was. Until June 1945, after the war was over, there was a knock on the door and there was my uncle, thin as a rail but alive. And what happened was that during that lunch he had with his friends, you know, at the streetcar company, they started talking about the war, and my uncle said, "Why doesn't Hitler give up? They will never win the war anyway." And when he was going home, waiting for a streetcar, somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Come with us," and it was the Gestapo. And they charged him for being a defeatist and not wanting the Germans to win the war. So they put him in a concentration camp until the war ended. And he wasn't Jewish, so he was hoping he wouldn't wind up, you know, in Auschwitz or some such place. The place he was in was mostly political prisoners, people who had spoken up against, you know, Hitler or the regime or the war or whatever. And sure, they were scared all the time because you never knew from one day to the other what they were going to do to you. Probably the happy stories was before the war, when I still lived in Vienna, because Vienna was a nice city. Lots of museums. Every Saturday afternoon my mother had time off and my father took me out. And he always took me to places like skating in the winter, swimming in the summer, going to the museum. And of course we visited my relatives all the time, especially Liesl and her family. And we all had a good time.